I never thought I'd be holding an eviction notice in my own home. But there it was, stamped and signed, demanding I leave the house within 30 days. My stepmother, Clara, had finally made her move. She'd been cold and distant since Dad passed away 6 months ago, but this was a declaration of war. I stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Dad and I used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, and felt my hands tremble. Clara had always resented me, but I never imagined she'd try to kick me out of the only place that still felt like home. The notice claimed Clara was the legal owner of the house now that Dad was gone. She'd even hired a lawyer to make it official. But something didn't add up. Dad had always told me the house would be mine one day. He'd said it so many times, especially during those long nights when we'd sit on the porch and talk about the future. Clara had only been in the picture for the last 5 years, and she'd never been kind to me. She'd married Dad after his health started declining, and I always wondered if she was more interested in his money than him. Now, with him gone, she was showing her true colors. I decided to dig through Dad's old files. He'd kept everything in his study: tax records, bills, even random receipts from years ago. As I sifted through the piles of paper, I found a folder labeled House Trust. My heart skipped a beat. Inside was a document I'd never seen before. It was a trust agreement, dated years ago, stating that the house was to be held in a trust for me. Dad had set it up to protect the house from being sold or taken away. Clara's name wasn't even on it. I felt a surge of hope, but knew I had to be careful. Clara wasn't the type to back down without a fight. I took the document to a lawyer who confirmed it was legally binding. The house was mine, and Clara had no claim to it. But the lawyer warned me that Clara might try to contest it in court. She'd already shown she was willing to play dirty. I decided to keep the discovery to myself for now. I wanted to see how far Clara would go. A few days later, she called me into the living room. She sat on the couch, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "I'm giving you one last chance to leave quietly," she said. "If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." I just nodded, playing along, but inside I was already planning my next move. Clara didn't stop there. She started spreading rumors about me to the rest of the family. She told them I was being selfish, that I was trying to take the house away from her. Some of them believed her and started pressuring me to back down. But I held my ground. I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let her win. Then, one evening, I found something else in Dad's study: a hidden envelope tucked inside an old book. Inside were bank statements showing large withdrawals from Dad's account in the months before he died. The money had been transferred to an account in Clara's name. It looked like she'd been stealing from him. I couldn't believe it. This was the evidence I needed to expose her. I confronted Clara with everything I had. I showed her the trust document and the bank statements. Her face went pale, but she tried to bluff her way out of it. "You have no proof," she said, but her voice shook. I told her I'd take it to court if she didn't back down. She knew she was cornered. The next day, she packed her bags and left. The house was finally mine, just like Dad had always wanted. But it wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for myself and honoring Dad's memory. Clara had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she was the one who lost it all. The days after Clara left were quiet, almost too quiet. The house felt different now, like it was finally free from the tension she'd brought with her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Clara wasn't the type to give up so easily. Sure enough, a week later, I got a letter from her lawyer. She was contesting the trust, claiming Dad wasn't in his right mind when he set it up. My heart sank. I thought the fight was over, but it was just getting started. I met with my lawyer again, and he assured me the trust was solid. But Clara's legal team was aggressive, and they were digging into every detail of Dad's life, trying to find anything they could use against me. They even subpoenaed Dad's medical records, looking for proof that he wasn't mentally competent. It felt like a violation, like they were tearing apart his memory just to win. I spent nights going through old photos and letters, trying to remind myself why I was fighting. Dad had always been so clear about wanting me to have the house. I couldn't let Clara take that away. Then, something unexpected happened. I got a call from one of Dad's old friends, a man named Greg who'd known him for years. Greg said he'd heard about the legal battle and wanted to help. He told me something I never knew: Dad had recorded a video a few months before he died explaining his wishes for the house. Greg had a copy. My hands shook as I watched the video. There was Dad, sitting in his favorite chair, looking tired but determined. "If anything happens to me," he said, "I want the house to go to my daughter. Clara knows this. She agreed to it when we got married." I couldn't believe it. This was the proof I needed. I sent the video to my lawyer, who immediately filed it as evidence. Clara's team tried to argue that the video wasn't valid, but the judge wasn't having it. The case was dismissed, and the trust was upheld. Clara was ordered to pay my legal fees, which wiped out most of the money she'd taken from Dad. She didn't even show up to the final hearing. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved out of state, trying to start over. Part of me felt sorry for her, but most of me was just relieved it was over. With the legal battle behind me, I finally had time to think about what I wanted to do with the house. It wasn't just a building to me. It was a place filled with memories of Dad. I decided to turn it into a community center, a place where people could come together just like Dad had always wanted. I kept his study exactly as it was, a little museum of his life. Every time I walked through the house, I felt like he was still there, cheering me on. The last twist came a few months later. I got a letter in the mail, postmarked from a small town in another state. It was from Clara. She apologized for everything she'd done and admitted she'd been wrong. She said she'd been angry and scared after Dad died and she'd taken it out on me. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I wasn't ready to give it, but her words gave me a sense of closure. I realized then that the house wasn't just a victory. It was a reminder of how far I'd come. Clara had tried to break me, but she'd only made me stronger. And in the end, I got exactly what Dad had always wanted: a home filled with love, not lies. As the community center project took shape, I found myself surrounded by people who shared my vision. Volunteers came forward to help renovate the house, and local businesses donated supplies. It felt like the entire town was rooting for me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The house, once a place of tension and heartache, was becoming a symbol of hope and connection. Dad would have loved seeing it filled with laughter and life again. But just as things were falling into place, I got another surprise. One afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I found an old box tucked away in the corner. It was covered in dust, and the lid was barely hanging on. Inside were stacks of letters, photos, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal was Dad's. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. It was filled with his thoughts, his dreams, and his fears. Near the end, I found an entry that stopped me cold. Dad had written about Clara. He'd known she was after his money, but he'd married her anyway because he didn't want to be alone. He'd hoped she'd change, but deep down, he knew she wouldn't. The last entry was dated just a week before he died. "If anything happens to me," he wrote, "make sure my daughter gets the house. Clara will try to take it, but don't let her. I've left everything she's entitled to in a separate account. The house is not hers. It's my gift to my child." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. He'd known all along what Clara was capable of, and he'd tried to protect me. I felt a mix of sadness and anger. Sadness that Dad had felt so alone, and anger that Clara had taken advantage of him. But mostly I felt grateful. Grateful that he'd trusted me with the truth, even if it was hidden in a dusty attic. I decided to share the journal with Greg and a few other close friends who'd supported me through everything. They encouraged me to use it as part of the community center, to turn Dad's story into something that could inspire others. We created a small exhibit in his study, showcasing his life, his struggles, and his love for the community. People who visited the center would often stop to read his journal entries, and many told me how much his story resonated with them. It was like Dad was still here, still making a difference. Then, one day, I got a visit from someone I hadn't expected. It was Clara's sister, a woman named Margaret. She'd heard about the community center and wanted to see it for herself. At first I was wary. I didn't know if she was here to cause trouble or to make amends. But as we talked, I realized she was nothing like Clara. Margaret was kind and soft-spoken, and she seemed genuinely sorry for everything her sister had done. "Clara's always been selfish," Margaret said, "but I didn't realize how far she'd gone until it was too late. I'm sorry for what she put you through." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for the remaining legal fees Clara had owed me. "It's not much," Margaret said, "but it's the least I can do." I thanked her, but what meant more to me was her apology. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like I could finally close that chapter of my life. The community center officially opened a few months later. It was a sunny day, and the house was filled with people. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who'd heard about the project. I stood on the porch looking out at the crowd and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Dad's house was no longer just a place, it was a legacy. And as I cut the ribbon to officially open the center, I knew he was smiling down on me. The final twist came a few weeks later. I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small framed photo of Dad and me, taken on one of our pancake Sundays. On the back, in Clara's handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry." There was no note, no explanation, just those two words. I didn't know if she meant it, and I didn't need to. The house was mine, the center was thriving, and I'd finally found my peace. Clara's apology, whether sincere or not, was just a footnote in a story that was no longer about her. It was about Dad, about me, and about the community we'd built together. As the community center grew, it became a hub of activity. Local groups started hosting events there, art classes, book clubs, even a weekly farmers market in the backyard. The house, once so quiet and lonely, was now alive with energy. People often stopped me to say how much they loved the center, and how it had brought the community together. It was everything Dad had dreamed of, and more. But even with all the success, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. One evening, as I was locking up after a knitting class, I noticed an older man sitting on the porch steps. He looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. When I approached, he stood up and introduced himself as Henry, one of Dad's old colleagues from work. "I've been meaning to come by," he said, his voice warm but hesitant. "Your dad was a good man. I wanted to see what you've done with the place." We sat on the porch for hours talking about Dad. Henry shared stories I'd never heard before, about how Dad had helped him through a tough divorce, how he'd always been the first to volunteer for community projects, and how he'd talked about me constantly. "He was so proud of you," Henry said. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew." His words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time fighting for the house, for Dad's memory, that I hadn't stopped to think about how proud he would have been of me. Before he left, Henry handed me a small, worn notebook. "Your dad gave this to me years ago," he said. "He said it was a backup, just in case. I think it's time you had it." Inside the notebook were detailed instructions for the trust, along with a letter addressed to me. Dad had written it years ago, just after setting up the trust. In it, he explained everything. Why he'd chosen to protect the house, why he'd kept it a secret, and how much he loved me. "I know Clara will try to take it from you," he wrote. "But you're stronger than she is. Don't let her win." Reading his words felt like getting one last hug from him. I realized then that Dad had been preparing me for this fight all along. He'd known Clara would try to take the house, and he'd trusted me to stand up for myself. It was his final gift to me, not just the house, but the strength to fight for it. A few weeks later, I got a call from Margaret. Clara had passed away. She'd been sick for a while, but she'd kept it hidden from everyone. Margaret asked if I wanted to come to the funeral. I thought about it for a long time. Clara had caused me so much pain, but she'd also been a part of Dad's life. In the end, I decided to go. Not for her, but for Dad. He would have wanted me to be the bigger person. The funeral was small, just a handful of people. Margaret hugged me when I arrived, and we sat together during the service. As I listened to the eulogy, I realized how sad Clara's life had been. She'd spent so much time chasing money and control that she'd missed out on the things that really mattered: love, family, and connection. I didn't forgive her, but I did feel a sense of closure. She was gone, and with her, the last shadow over the house. After the funeral, Margaret handed me a small box. Inside was a key and a note from Clara. The note was short, just a few lines. I was wrong. The house was never mine. I hope you can find it in your heart to remember me as someone who tried, even if I failed. The key, Margaret explained, was to a safety deposit box Clara had set up years ago. Inside the box, I found a stack of old photos. Pictures of Dad, of me, and even a few of Clara when she was younger. There was also a letter from Dad to Clara, written just after they got married. In it, he'd asked her to take care of me if anything happened to him. She'd kept it all these years. I didn't know what to feel. Clara had hurt me, but she'd also kept these pieces of Dad, these memories that I thought were lost forever. In a strange way, it felt like she was finally giving me back a part of him. I added the photos to the exhibit in Dad's study, along with a small note explaining where they'd come from. It wasn't an apology, but it was a reminder that even the people who hurt us can leave behind something meaningful. The house, the center, and the community. It all felt complete now. Dad's memory was alive in every corner, and Clara's shadow was finally gone. I stood in the kitchen one evening, the same kitchen where I'd first read the eviction notice, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The house was more than just a building. It was a testament to love, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door, I knew Dad was smiling down on me, proud of the legacy we'd built together. The months that followed were some of the most fulfilling of my life. The community center became a second home to so many people, and I found myself surrounded by a new kind of family, one built on shared dreams and mutual support. Dad's study, now a quiet corner filled with his photos, journal, and the memories Clara had returned, became a place of reflection for visitors. People often left notes in a guest book, sharing how Dad's story had inspired them to reconnect with their own families or stand up for what they believed in. It was humbling to see how his legacy lived on in ways I never could have imagined. But life has a way of keeping you on your toes, and just when I thought everything was settled, another twist came my way. One afternoon, as I was organizing a fundraiser for the center, I received an email from a lawyer I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Inheritance matter, urgent." My heart raced as I opened it. The email explained that Dad had set up a small investment account years ago, one I knew nothing about. It had grown significantly over time, and now it was mine. The lawyer asked me to come in to discuss the details. At first, I was overwhelmed. Why hadn't Dad told me about this? But as I sat in the lawyer's office, listening to him explain the account, I realized this was just another layer of Dad's careful planning. The account wasn't just money, it was a safety net, something he'd set up to ensure I'd always be taken care of, no matter what happened. The lawyer handed me a letter Dad had written when he opened the account. In it, he explained that he'd kept it a secret because he didn't want Clara to know about it. "This is for you," he wrote. "Use it to build the life you deserve." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Dad had always been one step ahead, even when I didn't realize it. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to expand the community center and start a scholarship fund in Dad's name. I decided to use part of it to create a small garden in the backyard, a peaceful space where people could sit and reflect. It felt like the perfect way to honor Dad's memory, a place of growth and beauty, just like the life he'd wanted for me. The garden quickly became one of the most beloved parts of the center. Volunteers helped plant flowers and install benches, and soon it was filled with the sound of laughter and quiet conversations. One day, as I was watering the plants, a young woman approached me. She introduced herself as Emily and told me she'd been coming to the center for weeks. "This place saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "I was going through a really hard time, but being here, reading your dad's story, it gave me hope." Her words stayed with me long after she left. It was a reminder that Dad's legacy wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about the lives he'd touched, and the lives we were continuing to touch together. As the seasons changed, so did the center. We added new programs, hosted more events, and welcomed even more people into the fold. It felt like the house had finally found its purpose, and in a way, so had I. The fight with Clara, the legal battles, the emotional roller coaster. It had all led me here, to a place of peace and fulfillment. I often thought about Dad's journal, about the words he'd written so many years ago. He'd known what the house meant to me, and he'd trusted me to protect it. In the end, I hadn't just protected it, I'd turned it into something beautiful. The final twist came on a quiet evening, as I was locking up after a long day. I found an envelope tucked under the front door. Inside was a handwritten letter from Margaret. She'd moved away after Clara's funeral, but she'd been following the center's progress online. "I'm so proud of you," she wrote. "You've done what Clara never could. You've turned pain into something good. I hope you know how much your dad would have loved seeing this." Her words brought tears to my eyes. It felt like a full circle moment, a reminder that even the hardest battles can lead to something meaningful. I stood on the porch for a long time that night, looking out at the garden and the lights of the center glowing softly in the darkness. The house was more than just a building now. It was a symbol of resilience, of love, and of the power of standing up for what's right. Clara had tried to take it from me, but in the end, she'd only made it stronger. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the house or the center or even Dad's legacy, but for the journey that had brought me here. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I walked away, I knew Dad was still with me, every step of the way. This final section brings the story to a heartfelt conclusion, tying together all the emotional threads and delivering a satisfying resolution. It maintains the simplicity, detail, and twists that have kept the audience engaged throughout. Let me know if you'd like to adjust or expand on anything. The years rolled on, and the community center became a cornerstone of the town. It wasn't just a place for events or gatherings anymore. It was a living, breathing testament to Dad's love and the resilience of the human spirit. People came from neighboring towns to see what we'd built, and I often found myself giving tours, sharing Dad's story, and the journey that had brought us here. It felt surreal in the best possible way to see how something born out of pain and conflict had turned into a beacon of hope. One spring morning, as I was setting up for a storytelling event in the garden, I noticed an older couple sitting on one of the benches. They looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. When I approached, the woman smiled and said, "You probably don't remember us, but we knew your father. He helped us when we were going through a tough time." Her voice was soft, but her words carried a weight that made me pause. She went on to explain how Dad had loaned them money when their business was struggling. No questions asked, and never asked for repayment. "He said family helps family," the man added, his eyes glistening. And to him, everyone was family. Their story wasn't unique. Over the years, I'd heard countless tales of Dad's kindness, how he'd quietly help neighbors, friends, and even strangers without ever expecting anything in return. It was humbling to realize how much of his life I hadn't known about, how many lives he'd touched without ever mentioning it. The couple left that day with tears in their eyes, promising to come back and share their story at one of our events. As I watched them go, I felt a deep sense of pride. Not just for Dad, but for the way his legacy continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways I could never have imagined. The garden, now lush and vibrant, became a place of healing for many. We added a small plaque near the entrance, dedicating it to Dad. It read, "In memory of a man who believed in the power of love, community, and second chances." Visitors often paused to read it, some leaving flowers or notes beneath it. It was a simple tribute, but it carried the weight of everything Dad had stood for. Then, one day, I received a package in the mail. It was from Margaret. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden box. Attached was a note. "I found this while going through Clara's things. I think it belongs to you." I opened the box carefully, my heart pounding. Inside was a collection of Dad's old belongings, a pocket watch he'd always carried, a tie pin he'd worn on special occasions, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a letter, written in Dad's handwriting. It was addressed to me, dated just a few weeks before he passed away. "My dearest," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself. I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been my greatest joy, and I know you'll do amazing things with the house. It's not just a building, it's a part of you, just like it's a part of me. And remember, no matter what happens, you're never alone. I'll always be with you, in every corner of that house, in every memory we made together. Love always, Dad. I sat there for a long time, holding the letter, tears streaming down my face. It was like hearing his voice again, like he was right there with me, offering the comfort and guidance I'd missed so much. I placed the letter in the exhibit in his study, alongside the journal and the photos Clara had returned. It felt like the final piece of the puzzle, the last gift Dad had left for me. As the years went by, the center continued to grow. We added new programs, expanded the garden, and even started a small library in Dad's honor. The house, once a place of tension and heartache, was now filled with light and laughter. And though Clara's shadow had long since faded, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude for the role she'd played in all of it. Without her, I might never have discovered the strength I had, or the depth of Dad's love. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the sunset, a young girl approached me. She couldn't have been more than 10, with bright eyes and a shy smile. "Is it true?" she asked. "Did your dad really build all of this for you?" I smiled and nodded, motioning for her to sit beside me. "He did," I said. "But he built it for all of us. This place is about love and family and never giving up, even when things get hard." She thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "I want to be like that when I grow up," she said. Her words stayed with me long after she left. They were a reminder that Dad's legacy wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, too. It was about the lives we touched, the stories we shared, and the love we passed on. And as I sat there, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the sounds of the center bustling with life, I knew Dad was right. I was never alone. He was with me, in every corner of the house, in every memory, and in every heart that had been touched by his story. The house was more than just a building. It was a testament to love, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I walked away, I knew Dad was smiling down on me, proud of the legacy we'd built together. This final section brings the story to a heartfelt and satisfying conclusion, tying together all the emotional threads and emphasizing the enduring impact of Dad's legacy. It maintains the simplicity, detail, and emotional depth that have kept the audience engaged throughout. Let me know if you'd like to adjust or expand on anything.